Hey everybody. Starting this a little bit different than usual, and then we'll get to some charts. But the the bottom line for me in the market is, and I'll show you a bunch of examples, is there's really not a lot to do like immediately except wait. And I was talking to Brent, one of the guys on our team who's awesome. They actually all are. But I was talking to him about it this morning about this idea of activity, wanting to trade versus wanting to make money. And a lot of times, and you got to listen to me on this because it's really important. Um, a lot of times, I talk about this all the time that people just want to trade. And if you've got a really strong work ethic, kind of like I do, I work all the time, for better or for worse. You feel like if you're trading, you got to be doing something. I mean, that's what we do. We trade. And so if you're not careful, you can let your work ethic actually cost you money because it will prompt you to do things that you really don't want to do when you really shouldn't be doing them. And that's just the nature of hyperactive trading. And I kind of explaining it like this. If you're on a road where no matter where you are right now, you look ahead and you see what your goal is. Maybe it's a financial goal. Let's say it's a financial goal. You look ahead and you see your financial goal and you see the road in front of you. Um, you want to be going towards that goal. And the way to do that is to make money trading, to make winning trades. Not every trade's going to win. And so we can equate a losing trade with a step back. We equate a winning trade with a step forward. And we want to put one foot in front of the other, just like the song goes, put one foot in front of the other, and all that kind of stuff, right? So we want to be doing all that. And then the more often we put our feet in front of each other, the closer we get to where our goal is. So if you find yourself trading a lot, the question is, um, are your feet going forward? Like, are you walking forward, or are maybe you're just kind of walking in place, or you're even taking a step backward? And so when you take a step backward, you take a loss. Again, we're going to lose on trades, so we'll take these steps backwards. But if you're taking a lot of losses and what you should be doing is just standing there, then you're going to wind up going the wrong way. And so it just obviously, it takes you do the math, you wear the watch. It takes you a lot longer to get to where you're going, if you get there at all. Because if you take enough steps back, you're going to wind up losing sight of your goal. It's just too far ahead. But now let's think about it from a mathematical standpoint. Um, if, let's say, I don't know, I'll use a doable number. Let's say you have $100,000 that you're trading. I mean, some of you guys have zeros attached to that, and I love it. But let's say you have $100,000 that you're trading, and because you're over trading, because of this, because of that, you knock that $100 down not to 80, not to 70, but like to $60,000 because the market was bad and you just kept going. Hopefully, you never do this. It's too big a loss, but I'll use it as an example. So you knock 40% off of your trading account, and you shouldn't be trading because, I mean, maybe you're a fine trader, but it's just not the right environment, and you're too damn stubborn to figure out that maybe this isn't your environment. So you keep trading, you keep trying to push through, and then ultimately you're unable to do that. So now the market starts moving higher, as it always will. So the market starts moving higher, and now it's like, finally, I'm getting traction. Now I'm starting to make money. This is good. So look at me. My $60,000 is now up at $66,000. I've made 10%. Now my $66,000 is up to $70,000. Look at me. I'm really crushing it. This is awesome. Okay. Are you seeing the issue here? Meanwhile, the person who wasn't doing anything, maybe they dropped their account down to 90,000 just I mean, when the market's tough, unless you just go for a walk forever or something, when the market's tough, you're going to be giving stuff back. That's just the nature of trading, but you got to be quick to figure it out. So let's say you give back um, 10%, as opposed to 40%. Okay, now you've got $90,000 where the first guy has 60 grand. Now the market starts to turn around and you start making money again. Well, it doesn't take too long for you to surpass that original $100,000. It actually takes 11% to get back up there. Meanwhile, the guy that's down 40% at $60,000, I mean, you got to make more than 50%. I think, I don't know, I don't think it's 60%, but you got to make a crap load more money just in order to get back to where you were before. So the way I look at it is all of this is trading. All of this is trading. When there's trading to be done, when the market is spitting out money, it's important to go in there and get it, say thank you very much. That's how you grow your account. But the other way you grow your account, and it is still trading, is to step back and not try to force things, not try to push things when you're kind of pushing on a wet string. And I feel like that's kind of where we are a little bit now. I mean, there's stuff out there, certainly there always is. But the question for me is, are you going to be in here trying to grind out any little trade and try to get something out of it? And then at the end of the day or at the end of the week or even the end of the month, you're looking and you're saying, man, I worked a lot and I didn't get paid hardly anything. Or worse, I worked a lot and I actually had to pay to work that hard because I lost money. And so, kind of the moral of the stories, boys and girls, is that you have to look at everything in the aggregate as trading. You buy a stock, you sit and you watch and you wait, and maybe it's for a day, maybe it's for a week, maybe it's for a year, while the stock moves higher and it's making you money. That's all you're doing. You've already, quote, made the trade. You've exchanged your cash for the ticker for the stock, and now you're just sitting there, and you're watching it do its thing. And as long as the stock's moving up, I mean, seriously, the longer you wait, the more money you make. You're holding something for a bigger move, for a bigger gain. Again, as long as it's moving higher. When you're holding a stock for a bigger gain and it's moving down, um, you kind of need to rethink your trading approach here. So, but the thing is, you're waiting until you sell it. Well, the other half of that is you're sitting in cash and you're looking for something to buy, and you see some stocks that you think like, wow, these are really good stock. This is a really good one here. I want to get this one. But do you get it now? Do you buy it right now? Because you've got cash and you want to exchange it for a stock. Is now the time to do it? Or are you going to wait? Because remember, on the other side of the coin, you've got a stock and you want to exchange it for some cash to make some money. Is every minute that the market's open time to exchange that stock for cash and make that money? The answer's no. There's only one time to be doing that. And that's the time that you ultimately do. The rest of the time, you're just sitting around waiting. And so the reason I'm talking about this is because I just want to emphasize that this is a time in the market, and I'm really talking about this week, maybe last week too, but this is a time in the market where if you're not careful, you're going to slowly be giving profits back. And then that's like taking a few steps back on your road to wherever you're trying to go. So just try to be really cognizant of that. It's really important. So I want to look at some stocks here, but then I got some stuff to tell you at the end here. So just hang on to this, okay? Let's see. Okay. Yeah, so just hang with me all the way through here because I have some things to tell you that I think are really, really, really cool. Okay. So let's get to the appropriate chart here. So this is what I'm talking about. Like this is a nasty pullback here. Up until a couple weeks ago, I mean, that's still everything's okay. Oh, look, it's fine. Okay, well, crap, that's not fine. Okay, that was just on Friday. So, right about here is when everything kind of changed from here. And now it's just still getting worse. And so, if you're in here trying to catch stocks, you're really you're trying to catch the proverbial falling knife. I'll just put it this way. It's like there's a bunch of hot coals falling from the sky, and you're trying to catch them. And what's happening is you're getting your hands burned, and you'd be better off just to step back. This is where I think we are right now. You shouldn't be really doing much here. Now, you guys in the forum and ladies too, but you guys in the forum, you're making a lot of fast trades, and that's totally fine. I think I don't know. I saw somebody today talking about closing his short positions, that type thing, and I'm thinking that's trading. That's what you want to be doing in this environment. However, most people you don't short stocks. That's a specialized game. That's if you're think about it as a doctor. You're not a general practitioner when you're shorting stocks. You are a surgeon. So there's people in there that are doing really well. But for folks that are just long only, this is a tough market to be stepping in front of this stuff. So you're just, really better off waiting. But you really do have to wait because this will find support. Maybe it'll find it here at the 50, maybe it won't. But unless something happens that I've never really seen happen before, if the Qs here come down and bounce off the 50, they're not going to do this. It's not going to do this. In other words, you're going to have plenty. If this is a rebound that's actually going to work, and first, we don't even know if it's going to rebound, but if this is a rebound that's actually going to work, you're going to have plenty of time to get on board. You'll have plenty of time to get on. So don't try to catch it right at the turn because guys, this may not turn. This may, we've got the Middle East thing and all that jazz, and then the CPI, and is the Fed going to lower rates just because Trump wants them to? I kind of don't think so, but nobody asked me. But is the Fed going to do that? What's going to happen? There's just so many different variables, and none of them are really good. Like, what's the variable? Well, it could either be good or it could be great. Those aren't the variables. It's kind of like, is it going to be okay or is it going to be not so okay? Is it going to be bad or is it going to be really bad? Okay, so that's the wall of worry, but I know the market likes to climb the wall of worry, but sometimes the wall of worry gets a little bit slick and there's no real handholds or footholds, and then we get this kind of slide here. So just think about what I've just mentioned as far as um, not over not over trading. There's a reason why I don't have many stocks on our active trades on our active trade list. And one of them, I mean, I'll just show you here. One of them, AEHR. This one was put on. This one here was put on. You can see on the 4th here, and we got stopped out. I'd mentioned this. I always keep my notes here. These are kind of my trading notes. I think it's important for anybody have trading notes. I don't care if they're on a piece of paper, whatever. I like to keep mine on Trade Track, but I also have to keep them here so you can see them. But have notes so you can look back and see what you did, what you were doing. Okay, so this is one that we're at 2R now, which is impossible because if it's 1R, you're out. That's what your risk is. That's what your stop is. And then I put another one on just today. And why? Well, because it was rebounding. It was rebounding as expected. I'm putting a new trade on here with a stop based on the 50-day moving average support. So this is down 7%. If you look at this here, so the moving average is clear down here. So this could go a little bit further, but this is 4 days in a row that this stock is down. I thought what was kind of enticing, I'll say, about yesterday was this. It gapped down to here, okay, and then it traded clear off the 50. I'd mentioned that yesterday, and then it rebounded, but not that great. But still, it was a rebound, and that's when I'm saying, okay, well, I think this is going to be okay. But then today it says, well, I'm actually not going to be okay. A higher low, and that's fine. So we could ultimately look at this and say, well, it's going to rebound off the 50. Look at that, just like Dan said. If it does, it's not just like Dan said. That's just what these stocks tend to do. But this is really too early to be buying that based on what we see here. Now, this morning, the stock gets clear up to here. It runs up 13% from where it opened. This definitely looked like a decisive bounce off of this low here. But as it turns out, not so much. So I think this is probably just going to grind sideways for a while. And if you're looking to buy this right now, I just wouldn't do it. I would say, Dan, I think I'm just going to sit here with my cash, waiting to exchange it for the right ticker. This might be it. It might not be it, but it definitely ain't the right time. And so that's what I have to say about that. But just generally speaking, like this Marriott, I think we got a nice trade going on here at 370. But this will. I'll need to close this out. I mean, maybe you already did here. I don't know. The current stops at 384.50. Yeah, I guess I just put that in. I don't know. Sometimes I forget to mark up the charts. Now, on Trade Track, I don't have to worry about doing that because it does it for me. But anyway, so this is stopped out here. So we had a nice profit, 14 bucks. So it's okay. But anyway, and the others are kind of like, not doing much of anything. So I want to show you a couple things here. Valero. These are stocks with really, really good fundamentals, growing sales, earnings, and good profit margins. So Valero, nice to own. Don't buy it here. It's just not right to buy. Phillips 66, nice to own. Don't buy it here. It's kind of setting up, but kind of setting up doesn't mean buy me. And then we'll look at some others here. And then again, I want to talk to you about something. Okay, so this looks promising. And the reason I say that is because this is kind of a steep sell-off here. And I haven't really seen this type of a move here, which is what I would want to see in order to entice me to buy this. I think that it probably has a little more work to do here. We don't want to see in this market, because it's a heavy market, we don't want to see this type of thing jump on one day only to see it the next day come back down. So this is one to watch, but not to buy. All of these, again, good fundamentals. Analog, watch it, don't buy it. Oh, it's going to bounce off the 50. We don't know that. It's just at the 50. We don't know that it's going to bounce. Okay. Monolithic, another one. Oh, it's going to bounce off the 50. No, we don't know. Nothing to do. Lattice, look at that. It's going to come down and bounce off the 50. See previous example. Good stock. Love it. Nice uptrend. Who wouldn't want to own this? Nobody. Everybody'd want to own it. Who wouldn't want to buy it? Okay. This one, Constellium. It's an aluminum company. Bouncing off the 50. Not yet. Okay. Taiwan Semi. Gonna bounce off the 50. Maybe. Invent, gonna bounce off the 50, maybe. So what I'm saying is, guys, there's a lot, excuse me, there's a lot of there's a lot of stocks that are close to entries, and we're going to be buying some of those, but not tomorrow and not Friday. We're getting a lot of stocks that are, and that's just a handful. I was just kind of going through a much bigger list. We're going to be buying some of those stocks, but just not right away, because my goal for you, for the entire FTG trading community here, my goal is to help you make money, not to help you trade. And you don't need my help to trade. All you need is a mouse and a trading account, and you could start clicking and, and all that stuff. My goal is to help you trade well so you can trade profitably. And a lot of times that just means, I'm just going to sit on my hands for a bit. So, anyway, so I want to mention a couple things to you that I'm super, super excited about. I've mentioned this a time or two before, that we're making a lot of big changes with our community here, with the resources that you have. One of the things that I'm doing is I am handling options along with Andy Kwong, and we're going to actually combine options with stocks. We're going to marry the two into one subscription, and along with that. And by the way, one of the issues, and nothing against Sam, who's now left us, but a lot of people just had a hard time understanding his trades because they were pretty complicated, and so everybody trades a little bit different. But the important thing is, because you're here, it's important for us to be showing you the types of trades that you can understand. Like, no, you shouldn't pay me, you shouldn't pay anybody for the privilege of going, wow, that guy's really smart. I have no idea what he's talking about, but he's really smart. No, we need to be working on the same level, to where the things that I'm showing you are the things that you can understand, because the things that you can understand are the things that you can do. And the things that you can understand and the things that you can do are the things that you're going to make money on. And so that's where we're going with this. Andy and I are actually going to be trading the open on Friday. We talked about this yesterday, and he and I are going to be meeting about it again. And this is for Option Market Mentor, but I'm opening it up for everybody. So, if you say, well, I'm not a member of Option Market Mentor, well, guess what, dude? You are on Friday morning. Okay. You can come and you can say, well, I don't want to trade options. You don't have to. Why don't you just watch? Or you don't have to. You could watch the recording. But the bottom line is, we're going to do that, and we're going to kind of show you. We're going to show you some of the things that we're going to be doing, and I'm really excited about this. This is We're now kind of at my final step that I've been walking for over 2 decades, in wanting to build the type of resource, the type of community that I wish had been around when I first started trading. But it wasn't. I had to figure stuff out on my own, and over the last couple decades, I've had a lot of stops and starts. Some of you guys know my brother even sued me. Um, just a lot of bad stuff has happened. A lot of great stuff has happened. It's kind of been a mixed bag, but I'm now at a point where I have the team in place to where I can bring it all together. And so we're going to be combining stocks and options, but we're also going to be bringing in TradeTrack and StockWatch into this same ecosystem, because that does really round out my entire smart trading process that I talk about with the strategy. You got to have the strategy in order to pick the stock. You got to be able to analyze the market. Then it has to be, whatever you're looking at, it has to be actionable. Okay, then you have to be able to assess the risk and reward in order to even know whether the trade is worthwhile or not. And then finally, you need to be tracking your performance. That's real. I talk about, oh, tracking your trades. It's more like tracking your performance, just keeping track of it. How am I doing here? So that's really the whole process. And it just kind of makes sense now for me to be bringing this all together. Now, is that going to be at a premium price? Of course it is. We don't even quite, Brent and I are the ones that are really working on this. We're kind of working to finalize this. And there's some other things too, which I'll mention in a sec if I don't lose my train of thought. But so yeah, that price is certainly going to be higher than it is right now. Although I will tell you, it's going to be lower than the combined stock and option market mentor price. So I'm not jumping this up into the stratosphere to give anybody sticker shock. This stuff is still going to be very, very economical. But wait, there's more. Now, you may be going like, well, wait a minute. I like stock market mentor the way it is. Like, I'm not interested in options. Trade Track, I have an Excel spreadsheet. I like that just fine. Or, Stock Watch, I trade the IBD 50, which is a good thing to trade, by the way. So there could be things that you're saying, well, I don't want all that stuff. So what's to happen to me? And the good news is you could just stay right where you are. You can keep what you have right now. Now, prices going up on that as well, but not I'll just say you'll be surprised. So we're really being very, very cost sensitive. Some would say, maybe more than you should, but I don't care about should. I just care about what we're doing here. So you are my members. You are my people. You are our people. We're in this together. I call it a big trading tribe. Then I hear that Ed Sakota, one of the best traders ever, has trading tribes. So maybe I got to come up with something else. But the point is, we're all in this together. And so I look at you, if you're watching this video, I look at you as a founding member. You're one because we are changing things in a big way. And if you're here, you are our founding members. You're one of the, at some point, you're going to be able to look back and say, yeah, I remember. I remember back then, before Dan did this, that, and the other thing. And it's actually, I was thinking about this earlier too. I mentioned this to Brent and he started cracking up. Back in, I think it was 1986, John Fogerty, and some of you guys know, at least you don't know this story, but you know some of it. Back in the late 80s, John Fogerty, before he came out with his center field record, he was making a comeback. He had big lawsuit with Fantasy Records and Saul Zaentz, who was a real asshole, and hadn't been able to play music for a long time. So he was finally coming back, and he put together this thing with Warner Brothers for a Westwood One. I think it was on MTV too, but it was a Westwood One special called John Fogerty and the All Stars. And it was John with his group of what he called like all-star musicians. Prairie Prince, who was the drummer for the Tubes, and he had played with Chris. I forget his name, but some really, really real luminaries. And then also, Albert Lee, awesome guitarist, Duck Dunn, bass player for Eric Clapton, and also the Blues Brothers, Steve Douglas, sax for Dwayne Eddy, and all these other things. So the bottom line is, these were great, great musicians, and I was one of the background singers. I was the only white dude in a sea of black guys. They were all my buddies. And so it was interesting, though, because when I went, I was living in San Diego at the time, and I left work for a couple weeks to do this gig. And the first day when I went up there, I got there a little bit early, and I'm kind of hanging around, and then in walks John Fogerty. and he was so nervous because remember he hadn't played live in forever, like probably I think over 10 years, like it'd been a long time. So he comes in and he's pretty nervous. And I think there might have been a couple other guys there just kind of setting up, but I'm hanging around. So he came over, he introduced himself to me. We were talking a little bit, and then he looks at me and he goes, "Hey, do you mind if I go to the bathroom for a minute here before we get started?" You know, and here I am, some like 27-year-old kid going like John Fogerty, the John Fogerty. Like one of the first songs I learned was Bad Moon Rising and Down on the Corner. John Fogerty's asking me if I would mind if he went to the bathroom before we started playing. And I remember looking at him and I went like, "You're John Fogerty. Yeah, you can go to the bathroom. In fact, can I come with you?" And he started laughing. But the point is, like, I remember stuff like that. And I have always, this is a long way around for me to get to where I am now. I have always remembered that and a few other things. And when I look at John, touring all over the world, he was just on Joe Rogan's podcast. He's done a lot of great things. I always kind of take a little pride, like I was there when he first started. Like I was there. It was amazing. And so when I think about that, whenever I hear John, I always think about that, and I'm really proud. I think he could have done it without me, and I didn't go to the bathroom with him. The point that I'm making is I'm looking at all of you as my founders. I'm not going to ask you if I could go to the bathroom, but I look at you as my founding members here, and so you can look at the price now that on I think they at on the website, but that's for new people. It's for new members. It's not for you. And so just be mindful. You're going to be hearing more about it in the next week or two. We just have some other things to work out. And then for annual subscribers, we're going to be doing some things for you as well. And by the way, if you have any questions about any of that with respect to annuals or just in general, email Karen at stockmarketmentor.com, and she can help you out. But this is the kind of thing that we're working on, aside from the things that I already talked about, and I'm sure I'm going to miss some. So Andy, who's definitely the smartest guy in any room, including a room full of brainiacs, he's working on some AI things to basically create a body of knowledge that people can use to analyze their own portfolios. And it'll be the equivalent of you tapping me on the shoulder and saying, "Dan, come over here. I want to ask you about my trading. I want to show you what I've got in TradeTrack. What am I doing wrong? How can I fix it?" We want to be able to do that for each one of you. So it's kind of like a personal one-on-one consulting. And another thing is, and this is something that Brent just showed me earlier today. I'll show you. I'll show you the chart in a second. I did. Here, I'll get to this. I'll show you in a sec because this is really cool. I don't think that's going to happen. So this is really cool. Fix. Okay, remember yesterday on the chart, on the free chart video or whatever, I was analyzing this here. And I was pointing out like, hey, this looks like it. By the way, think about what I'm saying about a while ago about all the stocks that are going to bounce off the 50. And I was analyzing this yesterday in the chart video. And I said like, hey, look at this forming the left side of the base, the bottom of the side of the base. Looks like it could bounce off the 50, but not yet. Watch it. Wait. Don't buy it. It may bounce off of the 50, but this, you don't know. You don't know. That was really my admonition. And then so today we get this, right? And so Brent, he emails me this thing. He goes, "Hey, you gotta watch this. You gotta look at this." And I said, "Okay, what's this?" And anyway, let me get off of this here. So, and I'm just about done here, guys. So he showed me this video, and it was of me, and it was what I thought was the transcript from what I was saying yesterday. But there were a few things in there that I'm going like, I don't think I really said it quite that way, did I? It was like kind of dead balls on though for what I was saying. And only the one thing that bugged me was it had I heard my voice and I'm going like, is that really how my voice sounds? And Brent goes, yeah, it kind of is. And I'm going, okay, well, can we change that? Because I sound like a tenor, which I am. But anyway, the bottom line though is that analysis that was coming through was not me. It wasn't based on anything that I did yesterday. It didn't have that information from how I analyzed that chart. What happened was a lot of the a lot of the data that I've created throughout the years, whether it's my videos like this, my writings, my courses, things like that, that was all dumped into a big tool, and then the query was basically, hey, what's up with Fix? And then that's what came out. The bottom line is we're building stuff like this for you to use. And I was telling somebody, I said, you know what my goal is actually? My goal is to make me obsolete. I want to be out of a job where we don't even need me to do whatever we're trying to do here. I'm not ever going to be able to get to that point, but hopefully I'll get pretty close. So all I'm telling you is we're really, really working hard to do a lot of great things. And the cool thing is we've got the technology now. Things are advancing so fast that we're able to do a lot of things that in the past, frankly, I hadn't even thought about because I'm not much of a visionary in that way. So there's a lot of things coming, man. I'm just telling you, it's going to be so cool. But again, don't think that, well, I don't want to go along. I don't want to go on that ride, Dan. I just like stock market mentor the way it is. You'll have an opportunity to stay with that too. But I will tell you this, ultimately, you're going to look at the whole package and go like, okay, well, maybe I'll do the other stuff too. Anyway, so that's all I got for you today. I will see you tomorrow, okay, in the trading room. All right, guys, have a good one.